Now, why did the Prophet ﷺ select the immigrants? So the ones that were the Muslims that were from Mecca and had moved to Medina, rather than the Ansar, the helpers, the ones in Medina who were the believers. There's multiple reasons for this, and it shows the wisdom of the Prophet ﷺ. The locals of Medina, they were quite rich. They were well acquainted with with the local economy. They had various resources and products that they were selling. So for example, Medina is quite famous for dates, and they had a well-established economy in there. And the immigrants from Mecca that were coming in, there was a risk that this large population that was coming into Medina, these refugees, if you will, there might be a drain on the local economy. How are they going to fit into this very wealthy region? And their background was mostly merchants and bankers and the like, right? So the Prophet ﷺ, through his wisdom, he utilized this population and their ability to conduct these long travels, being merchants, their familiarity with the surrounding regions, being merchants and traders and the like, and utilize them for the battlefield, for the raiding. And I'm going to go into a bit more on why these caravan raids can't really be equated to battles as per se. Another reason the Prophet ﷺ chose the immigrants, the Muhajirun, to do these raids is because the Quraysh were actually, once the Muhajirun had moved to Medina, the Quraysh were actually capturing their personal goods and were trading them on the markets with the various allied parties that they had in the form of trade. So a lot of these caravans that were being raided actually had the items that the raiders would actually owned rightfully. Because these items belonged to the Meccan Muhajirun that had moved to Medina with the Prophet ﷺ, it's interesting that the Prophet just chose them to participate in these raids initially. These raids that were known as Ghazu were actually very common during this period of history in 7th century Arabia. They were often conducted in times of hardship, and what more hardship can you get than the Muhajirun who had to leave their homes behind, who had everything taken from them in Mecca, and were a community living in exile in Medina. And it's important to note this wasn't only in 7th century Arabia. This kind of culture, similar cultures occurred way before, and this is even documented in the Old Testament, where several prophets have been reported to have led raids against their enemies and captured their property.